Hello and welcome back to the Virtual Classroom AP Euro Edition. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. Today's topic is the very important, the Renaissance. Now, before we begin, as always, take a moment, hit pause on this video, jot down that lecture outline to the right, and pay particular attention to all those key terms there on your left. You got it? Let's get started. Now, before I begin here, this is one of those really important lectures. It's a very highly tested subject on the AP exam. And just in general, this lecture in part 1, part 2 here is really what's going to change the world. It changes, especially Western Europe, and sets it on a path that, well, one of the reasons why the world is so Eurocentric. So again, this is one of those really important lessons in history, and also one of my favorite ones to do. In fact, all these next few lectures are kind of my favorite ones of the year. Like I like the foundational stuff. Like, why do we start getting to this other issues? And so the Renaissance is one of those things that I am actually passionate about in European history. And to be completely honest, it's one of the few things I'm completely passionate about European history. And I've had the fortune of being able to travel to some of these places. I spent a couple weeks in Italy, went to speak a week in Rome, week in Florence. I got to see some of these artworks and architecture. And so it means a lot more to me. It's a lot more personal. But let's begin. So, Renaissance. The Renaissance is considered the beginning of modern European history. Renaissance is the rebirth of antiquity. In fact, if you define it, go back to its original etymologies, Renaissance literally means rebirth. And it's the rebirth of antiquity or rebirth of that Greco-Roman civilization. So it's a rebirth of that ancient antiquity that we can draw from to make our civilization great again. Again, it's all about making Europe great again. And so Renaissance. Now, officially, we count the Renaissance starting in about 1300. And again, it runs from about 1300 until about 1600. And again, these are rough dates. And everywhere you look, every source you'll look for, like you see on the right of your screen now, that says Renaissance Italy from 1350 to 1600. My source said 1300 to 1600. Actually, one of my sources actually says 1300 in Italy and lasts about 1527. So it's a little bit earlier date. But the reason for that is that what we're going to see, what we're going to understand here, is that the Renaissance occurs in waves, right? So it's not just, well, hey, it happened right here and then it stopped and we have something. No, it occurs in Italy, starting about 1350-ish. Then it begins to move northward in the 1500s, and it moves further northward. And then we actually have a separate lecture called the Northern Renaissance, and how that is different. And that would be something you must compare in an essay form to understand exactly this comparison, how things are different between the Northern and Southern Renaissance. But either way, it'll spread to Northern Europe around 1450. And in England, you don't even get the Renaissance occurring in England, remember it's an island nation, until the 16th century, and it will last until the early 17th century. You're talking, they've already started colonizing America, and they're still getting the Renaissance. Of course, the example of this, I'm sure you all know, Shakespeare, a Renaissance man himself. Now, the original concept or the idea of the Renaissance was coined by a 19th century historian by the name of Jacob Burckhardt. Jacob Burckhardt. Now, Jacob Burckhardt claimed that the Renaissance period, beginning about 1350, was a time of distinct contrast from the Middle Ages. In other words, there's a marked difference that you can point to when you study history that says, no, this is a very different way of looking at the world compared to that time period. So we see this marked transition. And again, it's a slow transition depending on where you're at, and it happens over different times. But there is this marked transition between the Middle Ages and the Renaissance period. And so, now I do want to give a couple caveats here, because people are like, oh, the Renaissance, the rebirth, it's the greatest thing. Well, it was great. It's awesome. I love it. But it almost exclusively applies only to the upper classes. Now, there'll be some benefits to lower classes too. But as far as this idea of, art and antiquity and learning, it's pretty much exclusively for the upper classes. In addition, the reason for this is because the upper classes have the luxury of time to spend on learning the classics, and in comparison to poor peasants, they're literate. And therefore, peasantry is largely illiterate, and therefore the Renaissance ideals and idealism will actually have very little impact on the average common peon. And then you get the working classes who are much too far, they're too much preoccupied with just making a daily life, so they don't starve to death. So, let's see. Art, feeding my family. Again, priorities, people, priorities. And so, again, those are the few caveats. Realize it's mostly an upper class thing, but why? How was this able to occur? Well, the reality is, let me go back to the slide real quick. I'll start right here. Just start right here for it. So, to correct the effects of the Middle Ages, right? The Black Death, the political disorder, economic recession, all these things are plaguing those late Middle Ages that we talked about in our last lecture. And what we start to see is a vast economic recovery, again, circa 1300. Especially if you go back, you look on the top left of my screen, you see the term Hanseatic League. This is a term that you should know way back from AP World History. It's a term I also do mention in U.S. history, if you took, both has U.S. history. But it's specifically the Hanseatic League, and you see it kind of shaded in there. This was formed by German coastal towns to gain favorable trading rights in these Flemish cities. We talked about the Flemish cities last time. But it went beyond just economic. It was both a commercial and military league to stamp out piracy and other competition. Anyways, this Hanseatic League basically controlled the trade in, the Hanseatic Seas up there. It controls the trade in and around the Black Sea up there, controls trade all the way to Newfoundland in Canada, right? These are the guys that were fishing off the coast of Canada long before Columbus ever sailed the ocean blue in 1492. And so it was this commercial and military league that was able to help revive the economy, especially in the northern France area in Flanders. Remember, we had the big issue of Flanders with the 100 Years' War, right? And in addition, so you have the Flanders area have an economic recovery. And then on the south side of Europe in the Mediterranean Sea, in Florence, Florentine wool industry began to also experience a recovery at the same time that Italian cities had stolen the silk production away from China. Remember, if you remember your world history, on the Silk Road, they smuggled silkworms out in order to steal the technology from the Chinese. And Florence wool production, along with Italian silk production, began to also boom again circa 1300. In addition, in places like Florence, in places like up near Venice, they began to do dramatic transformations of glass production, glass blowing. And so what you have in Italy at this point is silk, glassware, and handmade items of metal and precious stones that are allowing, again, a rebirth of commerce. In addition, one of the reasons this is allowed to take place, not only do we steal silk from China, but we developed some new machines that are able to dig deeper in the earth to mine for these precious stones and precious metals. Thus, wool, silk, precious metals, glass all begin to build a rebirth of the economy following, the late Middle Ages. And then we have some social changes as well. Let me bring up this chart. I kind of drew this for you yesterday. I want to give you an idea of what life really looked like. Because the reality is, things were not necessarily the greatest. So at the top you have royalty, and then you have the nobles right below them. And for the most part, as we discussed last time, for most European nations, they kind of share power. And of course, the reason for that was that nobles have large freestanding armies, and royalty is kind of betrothed or beholden to them for military prowess, for financial issues. And the problem is, thanks to things like the 100 Years' War, thanks to, famine, pestilence, Black Plague, Black Death, you start seeing the real declining incomes of the nobles and royalty. You start seeing that it doesn't really pay for them to be able to go out and fight. Instead, it's to rely on the poor people and use them as cannon fodder. But what you see in the Renaissance period is a marked, remember we talked about the 100 Years' War, right? And how knights were displaying their chivalry by going off to fight the battles. And of course, we made the point that they really didn't have much of an impact on the war. It was mostly the foot soldiers, the peasantry, right? And so the nobles and their armies began to think, there's not much honor in death. So maybe we should stop focusing so much on warfare as aristocracy, knights. Maybe the aristocracy should stop trying to focus on becoming military genius generals. But instead, the aristocracy and knights should pursue chivalry and service by pursuing education in order to help maintain a stronger role in government. So there's a shift in the mental idea here, right? There's a shift in their mental perception of what does it mean to be aristocracy and noble. During the Middle Ages, it was about, fighting, right, and gallantry and, jousting, right? That was what they did. They're, knights, and this is what the aristocracy did for fun. But during the Renaissance, they would say, yeah, that invites too much death and costs too much money. It costs money to buy horses and armor and shiny armor and better armor and then go out and fight. That's expensive. Instead, let's put our money toward education. Let's put our mind toward things like chivalry and good manners and learn about education. And so they began to implement this plan and take more control of government. And so now chivalry is less concerned about bloodshed and more concerned about flamboyance, brilliant costumes, and intellectual prowess. In other words, long story short, nobles were now expected to display good character and grace rather than displaying just military skill. In other words, nobles must have a classical education and be well studied in the arts. Now, to drive my point home that the Renaissance was mostly about the elites, 85 to 90% of the population were considered what's called the third estate. Almost 90% of the population is not royalty, not aristocracy. So what did they see here? Well, we did see at the end of the Black Death, we will see largely, especially in Western Europe, the elimination of serfdom. So yeah, it's a great thing. Now, serfdom will still exist in Eastern Europe, but for the most part, Western Europe has allowed some legally free, peasants now. In addition, we will see that the merchant class, they form what are called the burghers of the city. So in the rural areas, it's the peasants and the serfs, right, still. But in the cities, you have the merchants and the artisans. You have the patricians who will focus on trade and wealth. And then below them, you have what's called the petty burghers, who are your artisans, shopkeepers, your guild masters, your guild members. So people with skill, right? And then on the bottom of them, you have still 30 to 40% of your town population that are propertyless workers and unemployed who live miserable, suffering lives. Oh, and then there's also slaves at the very, very bottom, because the Black Death did lead Italians to introduce slavery on a large scale. So while most of Europe will kind of end slavery, Italy will institute larger parts of slavery during the early Renaissance period as a way to shore up lost life due to all the death. And so it's especially important in Florence. I've been to Florence. There's some beautiful castles there. There's some, the architecture, the vineyard. Some had to work these fields. Some had to build these buildings, slaves. And so they begin to use the importation of foreign slaves, including slaves from Eastern Europe and Northern Africa. It was common for a wealthy merchant to have 2 or 3 slaves in their possession. And usually, young, obviously adults worked, but young kids, like girls, were nursemaids, and boys were actually playmates for the aristocracy kids. Now, by the end of the 15th century, so even half the Renaissance is over, the slavery has basically declined and almost been eliminated in Italy. And this is not necessarily, I mean, some of it was for humanitarian purposes, yes, with the ideas of, Renaissance, but more so the Ottoman Turks had conquered the Byzantine Empire, Byzantium, and basically closed the slave markets there. And basically causing the prices to rise of slaves, which meant that most Italians felt that the cost-benefit ratio was not in their favor. So what happens next now? So we've seen this transition, right? We've seen this transition from, thought process of, wow, maybe we should actually develop our political systems rather than just trying to beat the ever-living crap and kill people. Why not? We have rediscovered some of the antiquity ideas of Greco-Roman, art, Greco-Roman literature, and understanding some of their philosophies and ideals. And so what the first thing we start seeing is remember, this is an Italian phenomenon at first. It's going to spread elsewhere, but it starts in Italy. So we're going to focus on Italy for a while here. We start seeing Italian city-states begin to develop international trade. And we see the rise of these 5 major areas. And we start seeing that what are known as signores, despots, and or oligarchies. They begin to control much of Italy. Remember, Italy was not very unified. It was very much of a city-state mentality. Again, a la going back to the early Roman Empire and the Greek Empire. City-states. And so we start seeing, though, is during the early Renaissance, we start seeing the development of international trade in some major cities like Genoa, Venice, and of course, Milan. And again, Venice is obviously a very big port city. It was very important for the end of the Silk Road trade. And you start seeing these major cities develop an international trade. Now, to control this trade and kind of institute this new form of government, we start seeing oligarchies, despots, who control much of Italy. And they begin, though, they have to rely much on merchants, known as the commenda. Now, the commenda was a contract between the merchant and a merchant adventurer. In other words, these merchant adventurers would have to agree to take goods long distances. In return, they will receive 1/3 of the profits. And again, why that's important to commenda is because it's facilitating this international trade. And it's helping these oligarchs begin to develop enough wealth so they can control these areas, small kingdoms in Italy. And so the result is Italy becomes more urban. It has more towns and cities with significant populations. In fact, Italy had more towns with more significant populations than any other region of Europe. And again, we can't say country because Italy was not a country. It was not unified. It was more of a region still at this point. It's just how we look at things nowadays. And this competition, though, between these cities, these city-states, meant that they will never actually unify for centuries. But this is a very important concept I want you to understand because this is something that's often tested on the AP exam and essays. And it's known as what's called the balance of power. And the idea is, in Europe, this concept of balance of power is vital to understanding all of European history because it's going to continue all the way through the into the 1900s. It's one of the issues what causes World War I. The balance of power shifted. It's one of the issues that when Napoleon takes over in the 1800s, the balance of power shifted. So this balance of power begins to develop in Italy during the early Renaissance. And what the balance of power is that each individual city-state is a power in and of itself. They have an army, they have the financial resources, they have the people to fight. They also have the economy to keep themselves afloat, wherein no other major city-state is able to usurp the power to conquer the other people, right? And so what this does do, it prevents unification. But this concept of balance of power becomes a very important thoroughfare line when it comes to studying modern European history. And so some of these 5 major city-states and figures. The first one is Florence. So the Republic of Florence, now it's obviously just a city nowadays, but the Republic of Florence you see on your map, this was the center of the early Renaissance in the 14th and 15th century. So in the first part of the Renaissance, kind of the first half of the Renaissance, 14th, 15th centuries, this was the center of the Renaissance. Again, I spent a week there. It's gorgeous. However, this city-state, this region, this republic as it was called, was dominated by one wealthy oligarchy family known as the Medici family. And Cosimo de' Medici, he was allied with other powerful families of Florence, and he became the most powerful unofficial ruler of the Republic of Florence. And yeah, I say unofficial because he technically was not the ruler, but because he had all the wealth. Because he will become the kind of unofficial, official ruler of the Florentine Republic. And we'll get to him later. The most powerful of all these was Lorenzo de' Medici. Now, he's known as Lorenzo the Magnificent because he'll become a significant patron and pay for some of the greatest artworks ever produced in the world. And he, by the way, Lorenzo, for fun fact, is the son of Cosimo. Now, the second major region is the Duchy of Milan. And again, this is ruled by the Sforza family after 1450. And of course, Milan becomes a major enemy of both Florence and Venice, but Milan is important because of the glass production and the trade. Its location, Milan becomes a major financial center, Milan. Becomes this major financial section, and it has the ability to trade then with the Holy Roman Empire, but also over to France. And so it acts as this point of trade in northern Italy to spread out and create an international trade market. Then there's Rome, of course, the Papal States. And of course, the Pope serves as both a religious and political leader here, and controls, obviously, as you can see, much of central Italy. And then there's Venice, who I was talking about a second ago. Venice is a very important, the Venetian Republic is a very important port town, right? Because it's right there on the Adriatic Sea, and it serves as originally the end point or starting point of the Silk Road trade, but it also is able to connect then also to the Indian Ocean trade. And it becomes a huge, important trading post and port city. It becomes the greatest maritime power in Italy, and one of the greatest, the world's great naval and trading powers during the 14th and 15th century. And fun little side fact, it's actually the longest lasting of the Italian city-states. It would not succumb to foreign powers until Napoleon conquers it in early 1800s. All the rest of them are going to succumb to foreign rule at some point, except for Venice. And then the final one is Naples, also known as the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. And so you have the two you have Sicily, the island, and they call it Kingdom of Naples. They kind of combine together at some points. And so in the Kingdom of Two Sicilies, this includes both southern Italy and the island of Sicily. It was the only Italian city-state to officially have a king as their lead. Now, they will be conquered early on by France from 1266 to 1435, and then Spain thereafter. Now, these city-states, though, continue to grow and grow and grow. But as we're going to see in future lectures, as the rest of Europe develops these stronger, more powerful monarchical states, that's going to lead to a number of trouble in Italy and lead to the breakdown of that balance of power. So as other foreign monarchs grow in stature, in size, and in wealth, places like France and Spain, and their ability to conduct international trade, we're going to see the decline in the 1500s in the 1400s and 1500s, the 15th century. We're going to see the decline, the eradication of that balance of power, the breakdown. And we're going to see where the Duke of Milan is going to invite the French King Charles VII to help out. Milan is facing trouble internally from Italy, so he invites in a foreign power, Charles VII of France, to help him out. And so Charles does help out. He occupies Naples for him. So fantastic. But then other Italian states begin to call in Ferdinand of Aragon from Spain. And thus you start seeing the Italian wars between France and Spain. And you start seeing this international fighting over Italy. And then ultimately Rome will be sacked in 1427 by the Spanish King Charles I. And so what happens is, in the reality, this happens a lot with nationalism ideas, right? Because fierce loyalty was not to the Italian nation. There was no Italian nationalism. They didn't see themselves as Italians. They saw themselves as Florentines, as Venetians, as Milanians, as Napoleons, not Emperor Napoleon. And because of that, they never are able to unify to expel foreign powers, i.e., France and Spain. And thus, they are unable to unite. They are unable to unite under the idea of Italian nationalism. And they will remain politically separated until 1870, when you finally will get the Italian unification. But going back to the 15th century now. And so finally in 1454, we will see that there will be what's called the Peace of Lodi, Lodi. And the Peace of Lodi will serve to end a half century of war in Italy. And basically this is only in part because of the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople leads to turning the tides, and where France and Spain are able to say, oh, okay, we have bigger problems to deal with now, and they are able to kind of put this on hold. And what happens is after the Peace of Lodi, Milan, Florence, Naples, they kind of unify together. And they kind of go against both Venice and the papacy. But while they do kind of take sides here, it does help restore the balance of power. So even though they will be disjointed, disunified, you will see Milan, Florence, and Naples kind of join forces with some kind of alliance system. And they will kind of be in an alliance against both Venice, the Venetian Republic, and the papacy. And this creates a balance of power in Italy, once again, to stave off these international influences, international forces. And this balance of power in Italy is going to serve as the model for the rest of Europe that we're going to see as we go into future lectures. Now, the last part before we get into actual Renaissance, culture, right? The last part of the political system is the birth of modern diplomacy. Again, this is a marked shift in how rulers looked at diplomacy. Of course, it is developed by Niccolo Machiavelli, who in 1513 writes The Prince. This becomes the quintessential political treatise of the 16th century. And he writes this book, just to give you some background, he writes this book, The Prince, after observing the political leadership of Cesare Borgia. He's the son of Pope Alexander VI, who had his own ambitions of uniting all of Italy under his control. So the son of the Pope, Cesare Borgia, Borgia, the son of Pope Alexander VI, he has his own ambitions to politically unite and unify Italy. And as he's observing this attempt, which does fail, Machiavelli begins to take notes and writes The Prince. And he realizes that, he says, at times, rulers need to act and behave like a lion, aggressive, powerful. But other times they need to be more cunning and like a fox. So be practical. So in The Prince, he addresses this acquisition and expansion of political power as the means to restore political order. See, in medieval thought, it was suggested that rulers should only exercise power for the common good. So you usually shouldn't go to war unless it's for the common good. But Machiavelli suggests that political activity cannot be restricted by moral considerations. On the other hand, rulers must act on behalf of the state for sake of the state and cannot be restricted by moral considerations. They must be willing to put their conscience aside and work for what's best for the state, not the people. In other words, the state is more important than the people who live in it. And therefore, newly acquired power must be used to destroy enemies, secure allies and alliances, and win wars. In all this, the prince or the leader must be both loved and feared by his people. Thus, we can get these three main ideas out of the prince. Number one, politically, the ends justify the means. So no matter how many people must die to expand into new areas, if it's going to be better for the state long term, oh well, genocide away. The ends justifies the means. Number two, it is better to be feared than to be loved. In other words, rulers should invoke a healthy dose of fear. It's far more important to be feared than loved. Make people afraid of you, then they won't rebel. And then number three, rulers must be practical and cunning, in addition to being both aggressive and ruthless. So much being of the people, by the people, for the people. Machiavelli at his finest. Now, while of course this expansion of some of these rulers would cause some chaos, this newfound approach would offer some stability because this, again, takes time to filter through all of society. But when you combine this idea of stronger rulers along with the Peace of Lodi, we can now lead into the period known as the Renaissance. So we'll pick that up in this part B of this lecture. But until then, take care and bye-bye.